everyone who has met Matt before, please re-meet Matt Dyer. Matt is running for to be our representative in the Connecticut House, okay? And he will be representing the 66th district, which is Woodbury, Litchfield, Warren, Bethlehem, and Morris. Matt is a lawyer by trade, but actually he is an advocate by vocation. So I will ask Matt a couple of questions, and then we're going to open up the forum so you guys can ask whatever you'd like. My only request is that please raise your hand and I'll call on you, and I'm going to keep everybody else you know, kind of in the queue, and then we'll just go through and answer as many questions as we can in an hour. Okay, so Matt, welcome. How are you?
Good evening, and thank you. I am doing well. I appreciate everybody showing up tonight. I know that Zoom is not the most exciting way to do meet and greets. I'm hoping that eventually we'll get back into person. There are some in-person events happening over the campaign going forward, but we have to be smart. We have to be cautious, and I appreciate you all taking advantage of what we have for this early in the campaign.
That's awesome. So Matt, tell us, why are you running for House Seat 66?
So I'm running for, you mentioned earlier that by trade, I'm an attorney. By rights, I'm an advocate. I always have been. I kind of grew up always hoping that I was going to be a lover, you know, and I ended up not being a lover. I'm a fighter. It didn't necessarily come as naturally as I thought, but it's there. And I can't get away from it much as I've tried. I hate bullies, and I have, ever since I have been very young, I've recognized just how much fairness has mattered to me. I remember my mom telling me when I was a kid, you know, nobody told you that life was going to be fair. And I, of course, would then sulk my way into my room. And I would always think the same thing, which is, but why not? Why isn't it fair? You know, why are we so cavalier about the fact that life is not fair? Why are we so willing to say to ourselves that this is the way it is, and therefore this is the way it should be? So as I went to law school, I started I continued to ask myself that same question. The law is a clumsy way in some ways to right some of those wrongs, but a lot of those wrongs are legal wrongs that needed to be righted and need to be righted still by recognizing both the history of the law and the future of what we want as a society. That's why I'm running for office.
Thank you. So as you have talked to people and sort of looked around this district, what do you feel are the most important issues in this campaign to you and what you're running on?
So I have three primary issues that I'm running on right now, all of which seem to be issues that kind of hit close to home and in the pocketbook. The first issue is healthcare, primarily cost and quality. For the most part, people in this district have accessibility to healthcare, either through the job or through other mechanisms. But they have access to healthcare, so that's not as big a deal here as it is other places. I still think we need to make it accessible to everybody. But the big problem here is the cost of healthcare and the quality of the healthcare once you actually can afford it. A story that I continue to tell is a story of a local small businessman who has full health care coverage for his family, but he pays premiums for that, of course, and then he has a deductible on top of that. He has to pay about $30,000 a year in premium and deductibles before he sees an ounce of benefit. For some reason, we've decided that healthcare is the one thing that we should pay something for and not get a thing in return until we've paid some exorbitant fee. I mean, $30,000 is the average price of a new car. So he's got to buy a new car every year before he sees an ounce of benefit from healthcare. Ostensibly, there's a little carrot in there where he can get some preventive care by going to a physical annually, but I don't know anybody who's going to pay 30 grand for one physical per year. That just seems to be a huge problem, and we need to fix that. If we were able to put even 25,000 of that back in his pocket and have him actually have healthcare, that's a significant savings to every household in the area. Number two, broadband accessibility. That's key. That's actually something that's so key that it's being talked about in the legislature this year. The accessibility of broadband as we move to a remote workforce is sort of like electricity 110 years ago. It's kind of now becoming an essential need for everyone who's working in the workforce. There are, again, I think, some movement towards getting broadband accessibility, particularly up here in the hills, but the profit motive simply won't bring enough people to this area to compete for any kind of wireless, any kind of fiber, any kind of anything. We don't have nearly the numbers of people that they do in Hartford. So if I'm Comcast and have to make a choice to come up here or not, it's not a profitable venture for me. I'm not going to do it. So we have to find ways to get that done. Number three, and this is key as well, to me, which is accessible housing. In fact, there was a discussion on the floor of the House, I believe yesterday, that was noted in the paper today, where a 20-year-old was talking about the fact that kids his age can't live in the state of Connecticut. It's too expensive because of housing. They just can't live. So that is not a recipe for survivability. We are basically telling anybody who's under the age of 35 that you cannot be in Connecticut. They're going to go somewhere else and they'll start their families there. They're going to start their lives there. They're going to exist there. They're going to live, laugh, and love and work there. And they're not going to come back. They may come back in a kind of nostalgic way to look at, the old Constitution tree or something, but they're not coming back to stay. And that's not a recipe for success. If we want to turn ourselves into a demographic of just bedroom communities where we have an old demographic that turns over every 2 years, I suppose we can do that, but that's not how we're going to survive as a state. That's not a healthy environment. So we need to get housing available to young families, and we need to then get housing available to seniors who want to stay in these communities once they've lived here for 30 or 40 years. They're on a fixed income, as opposed to having to say, well, now I got to go someplace else that's lower cost of living or something that's hugely disruptive at that stage in life. That option needs to be available.
Okay. So, for the folks that are listening, if you raise your hand, I'll call on you, but I have a bunch of questions for Matt as well. So just stop me, raise your hand and we'll go ahead and take your questions. Matt, tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
Okay. So I grew up in very, very deep red state, Wyoming. And I was there until I came out to law school. So I think I moved out here when I was 24. And I've been here for now longer than that, for 20 years here. So Wyoming is a very interesting place. It's very rural, similar to what we have here. It's an extremely rural area. There's an awful lot of I don't want the government's hands on my whatever, guns or lives or houses or whatever it happens to be. So there's an awful reluctance there, in the same way that in this area, there's an awful reluctance to share anything governmental. So I have a lot of experience conversing with those types of arguments and those types of confrontations. It was a good upbringing, but it's different than out here.
Mm. You have 2 kids. You don't talk about them much, but you're a very proud father. And let me give you a chance to at least mention your kids and, what they both, how accomplished they both are. So,
yes, I have 2 children. My oldest is, I think he's 24 now. He's out in Seattle. He's in the military, serves, he's towards the end of his enlistment career as a nuclear technician on a submarine. He and I'll talk later this week. My youngest is at CCSU. He's 19. He lives at home with me here. I made a decision when I ran 2 years ago that my kids weren't going to be a centerpiece of my campaign because, number one, it's not my decision to make, it's theirs. They're both adults. They can decide what they want to be and what they don't want to be. And I'm certainly not going to force them to be part of my campaign. Mm-hmm. I'm exceedingly proud of them. They're the kind of the most important piece of my life. But I would never make them a political pawn. It's never a thing for me. So I don't talk about them in my political meetings for the most part because of that. They are great kids. I'm proud of the service that my oldest is engaged in. And I'm proud of the fact that I just got a letter from CCSU after my kids' first semester in in college after COVID, after his final year in high school, which was in COVID, where he made the presidential list for straight 4-point for him. So,
Wow.
yes,
Yeah.
they've taught me as much as I've taught them.
Yeah. And if you ever have a chance to, meet Aiden, ask him about the new video games to play, because he's right on it. He knows exactly which ones are like kind of happening.
Very
So
much.
I know that for the folks on this call, one of the big questions is, why do you think you can beat Karen Reddington Hughes? She's very well known in Woodbury. What makes you confident that, you can take her on?
Well, I will answer that in just one moment, but I will tell everybody that Zoom is just telling me that I have 2 minutes left on my call, because this is the free account still. Now, they've never kicked me off before, but in the event that they kick me off, please everybody jump back in. I'm in the process of upgrading, but because of SEC rules, I have to do that through the appropriate process, and I need to talk to my treasurer about that. So if it kicks us out in 2 minutes, everybody come back in. It'll be the same number, all right? With that, say that again, Navanita.
Oh, I'm asking, given the fact that, Karen Reddington Hughes is so well known in Woodbury, and, what makes you think you can take her on?
So a couple of things. First of all, I think it's essential that we look at the credentials that candidates bring to the table. Number one, the credentials that she brings to the table are small business owner for the most part, and being able to get the antique trail into Woodbury. Now, those are not small credentials, and I don't mean to undermine them. She's also with the on the Board of Selectmen. That also is not small, and I don't mean to trivialize any of that. However, what happens in legislation and what happens in the legislative office is entirely different than what happens in a small business. And I can say that as a small business manager and owner. I've had my own law practice, and I'm currently a partner in a law practice with 2 other attorneys. But the negotiation that's necessary to get legislation passed is not the same as what's necessary to get a balance sheet going from A to B. It's not what's necessary in terms of doing inventory and trying to make sure that my inventory matches. Those things are potentially transferable skills-ish. Mm-hmm. But what I bring to the table is advocacy. For 20 years, I've been an advocate for people who are not me. I advocate for things that are not mine. I advocate for ideas that are not necessarily mine. I'm a representative. That's what I do. As a counselor and as an attorney, that's my job. In every moment, I'm advocating for other people and for the needs that they have, even if those are different than the needs that I have.
All right. So you mentioned that, look, the skill set that's required to be effective once you become a legislator is a skill set that you have. And that's a skill set that you've demonstrated in a bunch of different ways, because you've had to deal with the bureaucracy by being a lawyer, and you've had to deal with some of the complexity of dealing with all the different governmental agencies and how you actually get things done.
And that's the second piece of it, Vanita, quite frankly, that I think everybody in this call has had the experience where you read a piece of legislation or something that's legislatively based, or a law that somebody posts somewhere, and you go, why is it worded that way? Well, there's a reason for that. There's 3 years of law school that I took, that there's a reason for virtually all of these words. Almost all of the reasons historical. It's because it came over from, English common law and the ways these things, but those words don't always mean the same thing in regular language that they might mean. So when you're crafting legislation, when you're crafting legal information that's then going to be applied in the legal world, words matter. And if you don't have any experience in that, then there's a hugely steep learning curve to get caught up to speed. Karen Reddington Hughes, if she gets elected, has that steep learning curve ahead of her in order to figure out that when you use the word consideration, it doesn't mean what you think it means. It has a very specific legal meaning. If you're using, mens rea, that has a very specific legal value that you need to do. And if you're going to craft criminal legislation, law that makes anything a crime, then you had better be prepared to make sure that you understand what those are. Otherwise, your law is going to get challenged, it's going to get struck down, and you have just wasted an enormous amount of time. Mm-hmm. And that's essential to what we're doing in legislation. It's essential. I have now, again, 20 years of experience in that language and in what's happening with that.
Now, the other thing that we've spoken of, I've heard you speak of, is having a seat at the table.
Mhm.
There are a lot of musical theater people on this call. I know they would call it being in the room where it happens, but hey. So what does that mean, having a seat at the table?
Well, first of all, I will tell you that we had tickets for Hamilton in May, the year of COVID. So yeah, we got him as a graduation gift for my youngest son because he's a huge Hamilton fan. And yeah, there you go. We didn't go. We didn't get to go. So I think they did refund us our money, but we didn't go. So that one of the things that the 66th has not had, and in some ways the 66th prides itself on not having this, is a voice that actually is listened to. So since this district has been created, it's been held by the Republicans. The Republicans have, since I've been here, for the most part, been a minority party. That would not necessarily on its face be problematic. However, the representatives that have represented the 66th, as well as the 30th and 30th and the 32nd Senate districts, have all taken essentially a hard line that says that anything that's proposed by the Democrats, we're just going to say no to. As a result of that, the Democrats know that when they want a bill sponsored, or when they want a bill that's jointly proposed or jointly sponsored, they don't come to these guys. That's not where they go. They will go to other places. They will go to other people, which means if that legislation has any obvious glaring holes, we'll never know about it. We don't have any input on that up here. The people that live in this district have absolutely no input on what's coming out. We're going to still be bound by it, meaning that if it's law that is proposed that applies statewide, it's still going to bind us. It's not like we're going to get away from it and say, well, you know what, we said no, so we really meant keep your hands off, and we're going to erect borders around Woodbury. That's not going to happen. It's still going to bind us. So if it's going to bind us, we need to have a voice and a seat, and we need to be ready to talk and communicate. That's going to require an awful lot more diplomacy than just no way.
The other thing is that being a Democrat, you're going to have more ability to caucus with and influence the people that have majority power, the party that has majority power. If you're a Republican, you've spoken before about, you can be a very good person, a nice person, you can be all those things, but you are not going to have the influence that we in the 66th district need.
No, that's exactly right. We've got to be able to tell the party in power if we see a problem with some bill, whatever the bill happens to be, juvenile crime, police accountability, the Voting Rights Act that was discussed on the floor of the House today, any of that sort of thing. We need to be able to say to the party in power, I'm not sure that's the best way to do that. Maybe this is a way we can do that better. And if they don't take us seriously, if they don't let us into the room, then we're standing out at the door, kind of like a child on Saturday night when mom and dad are pouring the bath. We don't get to stop it. It's going to happen. They're going to drag us by the ear and throw us in the bathtub. And we may be the third in line. Our two brothers have already dirtied the water and we just got to get clean. It may be cold and freezing. We have no input in this whatsoever. And we need to have input if we don't want to be basically buried under the powers that be.
That was a very Wyoming metaphor.
I know, right? Yeah, I know.
I got my spurs on my boots and I'm taking my bath after my two brothers.
You have no idea. I have a picture of me bathing in a sink. You know what I'm saying?
Well, So now, going back to this question of the things that you've done, tell us a little bit about the kind of law that you practice, because people want to know what you're saying, hey, this is a selling feature for me. Well, tell us more about that. Yeah,
so the central theme of all of my legal practice is courtroom work. It's litigation from beginning to end. My bread and butter for the most part has been criminal defense law. It's almost all constitutional based law, but it's negotiation from beginning to end. You negotiate with judges, you negotiate with prosecutors. Quite frankly, you negotiate with your own clients. It's about negotiation and it's about communication. That's the entirety of what I do in the criminal defense realm. Civil litigation is very similar. The law is different, but the process is slightly different procedurally. It's very different. But again, the skills are identical. It's negotiation and communication. It's being able to make sure that your message gets across. And number two, be able to recognize that the other person's message may actually have more validity than you want it to have. And so sometimes you have to pay attention to the other side. So it's listening and communicating. I've represented businesses. I've represented small businesses. I've represented individuals. I've helped people create businesses. I've represented people in enforcement actions with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. I've represented people in crafting contracts and in suing on those contracts. I just finished up a housing matter that was a commercial housing matter. So again, the unifying theme for me is that I want to represent, for the most part, real people. People make businesses. I want to help them do that. People earn through their businesses. I want to help them do that. People work in businesses. I want to help them do that. I want to make sure that people in our communities can live in our communities and stay there. So I represent them with the problems they have with the law, the bureaucracy, the just never ending walls that are being thrown up in front of individuals as they try to navigate successfully from beginning to end.
Okay. Well, let's shift topics a little bit and talk about crime. If I were a Republican, I would tell you, there's a lot of crime and it's getting worse. And, tell me a little bit about how you see that, especially from your vantage point.
Well, I don't know if you followed along with some of the conversations that have been happening over the last couple of weeks in terms of some of the juvenile crime legislation, some of the police accountability reframing legislation that has been proposed by the Republicans. It has a very similar characteristic to Turkey Lurkey and Chicken Little screaming that the sky is falling. Crime is something that I think is extremely difficult to talk about as a unified entity, but we do it all the time. We talk about what's the crime figure, what's crime like, what's the crime rate. Crime is enormously different across the spectrum. Are we talking about violent crime? Are we talking about property crime? Are we talking about personal crime? Are we talking about sexual crime? All of those types of issues are hugely different, and what goes into them is hugely different. Are we talking about crime that's caused in many ways because of a substance abuse issue or is peripheral to a substance abuse issue? Are we talking about crime that's peripheral to or in some ways relevant and related to something that has to do with mental health issues that are undiagnosed or that are diagnosed but difficult to contain? Since the 80s, and we basically turned every mental hospital out and said, now just go out to the community and figure it out on your own. There's not a lot of mental health resources that exist, and very many people that have major mental health end up with stupid little crime problems, shoplifting or having problems going to bed because they are being told to go to bed by somebody they don't want to be told to go to bed by, so they throw a tantrum and they get arrested for it because now they're 35 as opposed to 13. All of those are different elements to crime, and to talk about it like it's a single entity is problematic. Republicans are talking about it that way. If you look at the numbers from 2020 to 2021, there's been a spike of about 15% in auto theft. That's primarily related to what you can get out of a car, which is the catalytic converter and the rare metals that are in them. However, violent crime has dropped by about 20%. It's actually gone down substantially. And if you look at crime numbers overall since the late 1960s, all those numbers have dropped precipitously. From 2010 to 2020, crime rate, just overall crime rate, has dropped about 40% in Connecticut. And we don't talk about those numbers. We talk about just the little spikes that we can use to keep scaring people and terrifying people into voting for draconian and very authoritarian measures. So it's not that simple, is really the long and short of it.
Okay. Mark, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question? Please unmute yourself.
I'm going to be a bit contrarian here.
All right.
Karen, knowing what I know and knowing my wife and knowing Vanita, Karen may not be the candidate that you face. It may be somebody else. Who that is, well, there's speculation about it, but yeah.
Speculation.
But I think, and Vanita's probably kept you aware of what's going on in Woodbury also. So
I spoke to George Hale last
Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. Be ready for anything.
I love to hear it, Mark. I love to hear it. You're spot on. I talked to George Hale about it last week too, and I'm sort of watching with some bated breath as to what's going to happen now that the Republican Town Committee has kind of changed hands. And I have a phone call tomorrow that we'll be discussing that matter at. It definitely is something. I'm also going to be going to the Northwest Chamber of Commerce tomorrow. David Wilson is probably going to be there. So is Craig Minor. And I assume that Karen Reddington Hughes is going to be there as well, because she's been tailing around with David. She may be primaried. I have no idea.
So let me just bring a couple of points up for people who are not in the know so that you guys, can catch up. So as you know, the Republican Town Committee changed hands and it's become much more right-wing, or let's call it much more right-wing. So what happens is that that the town committees, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, they're the ones who send the delegates to the convention to nominate the people that would run for for Senate District 32, for all the various conventions. And so now that these folks in Woodbury have swung so far one way, the thought is it's possible that the newly constituted Republican Town Committee has a different idea of who they'd like to be represented by in the 66th district. So that's why, if Karen's already announced and Karen's already saying that she's running, there's a possibility there's a challenger to her at the convention. If that challenger beats Karen, or if that Karen beats that challenger, but that the person who loses the contest gets at least 15% of the vote at the convention, they can trigger a primary. If they get a little bit less than 15%, they can petition to do a primary. So there's some scenarios here that could change Matt's competitor. So that's what we're talking about, just so that people have a sense of that.
And I will note that Karen has come out and sort of tried to play some of the middle of the road. In fact, she's borrowed an awful lot of the language that I've used about having a voice and speaking to people and communication and all that sort of stuff. I'm not sure that, based on what happened in the Republican Town Committee in Woodbury, that's going to play nicely with some of the more hot-headed types, the firebrand flamethrowers that seem to be populating some of the party in this area. Bethlehem has a handful of them. Litchfield has a few. So I'm just not sure that it'll be reactionary enough. In the 2021 Litchfield municipals, there was some pretty reactive talk that had some value. It got some weight, but I'm not sure that Karen's brand of diplomacy, which seems to mimic my own in certain ways, is necessarily going to fly with some of those flamethrowers.
Well, and then once she gets to Hartford, your point earlier is right, spot on, is that, she may be herself a very middle of the road, person seeking consensus and, seeking collaboration, but she's part of a caucus that chooses not to play. Now, Karen's going to go there as a Republican. She has got to play with the team that she's on. Right. That's just the way that it is. And if anybody thinks that Karen can go and be a bridge as a first time, elected House official to go and be the bridge between the two parties, needs to rethink their understanding of, just dynamics, because that's not going to happen.
No, agreed.
Right. So other questions that folks might have, because we don't want to go down, this is, and mind you, I don't know anything about sports, but this feels a little inside baseball, like the stuff we're talking about. So I apologize. Sarah, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. So first, a quick comment that I think we can talk about crime in kind of a singular way, which is that people's needs are not being met and they don't have access to the things that they need in our communities and in the communities kind of at large. And that's where I think they're, and you spoke to a lot of that, Matt, about around mental health and other aspects. And even going back to the access to affordable health insurance and affordable housing, those are all part of the picture of people's needs not being met. and people really needing something. Crime is often stemming from people having a need and needing to find a way to meet that need.
I like that language a lot, actually.
It's a little bit the sea I swim in. So I'll find a different way to talk about it super easy, like it's, you know,
Yeah.
try to beat them at their own game. I don't know. But so my real question is, you know, so you ran before, where are we? What, you know, what happened last time? What's kind of, what are the thoughts about what's driving us, what's holding us back, how do we support you moving forward? And where are the kind of bumps in the road or the challenges that we can try to help address?
Okay.
Yeah, so
Let me just jump in because I want to unpack a couple of those things so that, you know, we can give people some action steps. So first, let's talk about what's different this time for you, why, you know, from the race that you ran in 2020. Let's talk about that first.
yeah, so we already mentioned a little bit about what's different in terms of now from 2020, which is that the Republicans are sort of cracking into a fairly reactionary group and a not so reactionary group that's trying to be sort of more along the lines of the Ronald Reagan types, where, you know, great communicators or whatever you will. I mean, I know that Ronald Reagan was kind of far to the right too, but he's not nearly what we have with some of the straight up authoritarianism that Trump has. And the Trumper types are starting to make a little bit of a play for some of the local parties, which is going to have some vote issues going forward. Demographics is our biggest problem up here. And so that also is a shift. Litchfield has become, Litchfield and Woodbury are the two biggest cities up here, or the two biggest towns up here. Woodbury, I think, has about 9,700 voters, and Litchfield has about 8,200, 8,150, something like that.
Yep.
They don't all vote. So I would expect we're probably going to get about 55%-ish voting turnout for both places. Litchfield voted for Joe Biden in 2020. That did not translate down the ticket. They stopped at Joe Biden. But there is an indicate. Litchfield also has had a first select woman, and the board of selectmen have been run by Democrats since 2019. That's shifting up here to a certain extent. I think the reactionary feeling in Woodbury is similar. A lot of people who have moved into Woodbury over the last several years have been a bit more New York liberal. They've been a bit more middle of the road, even if they come in as Republicans. And frankly, I think a lot of people are tired of just the hyper partisanship, and they want to know how exactly they're going to get their pothole fixed in front of their house. How exactly, if they have a kid that has, you know, some mental health issues, how am I going to get this fixed? You know, how am I going to get this stuff done? The very local things. So I'm going to do much the same that I tried to do in 2020. We had one other big problem in 2020. Number one, I was a hugely unknown commodity in 2020. I had just moved up to Litchfield in 2018, and COVID hit literally the moment I was going to announce my campaign. So in terms of being in public, talking to people, discussing things with people, there was none of that. It was all Zoom, which is fine. Zoom's great, but it doesn't necessarily give you a sense of who somebody is as much as just an in-person meeting would. So the ways that you all can help me with that is just spreading it out, letting people know that this is a guy you may want to just get some information on. I'm not afraid to talk to anybody, Republican, you know, Democrat. It makes no difference to me. I have had judges threaten to put me in jail. I'm not afraid of anything. I fought forever, like I said. So that's not a thing so just send them to me. Send them to my website, send them to whatever we need. Contributions right now are enormously helpful. Sarah, thank you. I got yours. I actually have a thank you card to be sent in the mail to you for that. I appreciate that. It's immensely helpful. The small dollar donations are enormously helpful to me because I need to get two things in order to qualify for a big state grant. I need to get $5,800 and I need to get 150 in-district contributions individual contributions ranging from $5 to $250. So
290.
Oh, it's 290 now.
Somebody's
That's-
thinking that you can do it, to 290, you max it, don't just send 300. Don't.
No, right, yeah, and 285 might just be crazy. So quite frankly, one $50 donation is not as helpful to me as two $25 donations. It's not as helpful to me as five $10 donations, quite frankly, because that 150 number of small dollar donations has to be met. And then the 5,800 is almost always up there. So I'm about a third of the way done. I'm almost to 60 in district contributions right now over the last 2 weeks. And I have about $2,200 already. So once I get that done, I don't talk about money, and I don't talk about contributions, and I don't talk about any of that stuff, which always feels so tacky.
So let me talk about it for one more minute. So the really good news is that, for where we are in the campaign, I mean, really, Matt's only been fundraising for about 2 weeks. And so for 2 weeks, he's doing really well. We have just really started to kick off, as somebody, I think you may have seen from Jeremy, that this is one of our first major meet and greets, with a fundraising component at the end of this call, because, I don't know if I'll be able to get it in the chat because, I'm listening to what you guys are saying, but you will receive a link to Matt's website on an email follow-up that we'll do, and you can go to that website and donate, and it's very helpful. And then the other thing is, and this is where I'm going to show you how I really ride the line, because I'm going to talk to you about the Breck girl. Remember the Breck girl who would have her hair and she would tell two of her friends, and they would tell two of her friends, and they would tell two of their friends. And then for the folks that don't remember the Breck girl, this is how you build influence, is by getting people to follow you and people to, actually pass on your message. So we're looking for folks that would be willing to host these kinds of meet and greets, as Natasha and Bernardo were nice enough to do for us this meeting, and other, venues and other events that we might be able to quickly do the fundraising, so then we can shift to just demonstrating Matt's great charm and wisdom. Oh, and Sarah was kind enough to go ahead and put the link in the chat. And yeah, it's really, really easy to do online. So Matt, I want to also mention a couple of differences between this cycle and last cycle, just so people understand why we feel more confident. One thing that this cycle, because Matt's more educated about the system, he's monitoring things like, okay, what kind of contributions am I getting on a daily basis? Where am I in the process? He's much earlier in the process than he was last time, because here we're the middle of March and we're already, halfway through the process, whereas he wasn't even, nobody was close to it at this time last cycle because of COVID, et cetera. The other thing is that we are really, and I'm saying we because I'm working with Matt on the campaign, but we've got more people on the team doing more specialized and specific work. So for example, we've got somebody who's really starting to kick off the social media, and we've got, somebody who's really working to get the website optimized and to keep that up and running. We're working with someone to help us really define the strategy of how we reach out to those voters that are Democratic loyal voters, and then all the way through the spectrum to the people who are unaffiliated, who are Democratic leaning, et cetera, et cetera. It's voting, you have a win number. You need to know how many votes you need in order to win the election. And we're just, getting a little bit smarter about understanding how to achieve that win number. Sarah, did we answer all your questions? Is there anything else that we should cover? Okay, anybody else, or anybody have a follow-up question to anything that we said? Don't ask me about the Breck girl. I told you everything I know, okay? All right, so then Matt, I want to, we don't want to take up more time than we need to, but I do want to have you make your why should we vote for you summary statement. I'm going to give you 90 seconds, and I know you can do it.
Yeah, so the reason to vote for me is twofold: accessibility and communication. Number one, I'm available. And number two, I know how to explain and communicate some pretty complicated types of linguistic situations. The law is not terribly complicated, but the language the law uses is exceedingly complicated. And it's designed to keep certain people out. And it's designed to make sure that only certain people, those of us who have spent a ton of money trying to get law degrees, can actually talk to each other. And we can do it in a way that we can do it at, coffee parties and nobody will know what we're saying. What I do is I communicate to people who are, for the most part, under the gun for a whole host of different reasons. They're under the gun because they've been arrested. They're under the gun because they've been sued. They're under the gun because they want to sue. Whatever it happens to be, they are now embroiled in a scenario that they don't understand, involved with a bureaucracy that they may or may not understand. They may partially understand it. They may have watched Law and Order enough to think that they understand some of it, but not of that. All of that translates very well. Connecticut's a different state than California and a different state than New York. My job is to make sure that people, when they make decisions within the context of the legal community, understand those decisions. What I bring to the table here is the idea that what I'm going to give to you guys is the ability to ask me the question and to get an answer that makes you understand why we are where we are and what we're trying to accomplish. I can then carry to the people in Hartford what you guys want to accomplish and why you want to accomplish it. And I can communicate to those people in the same clear-eyed manner that I communicate with you, so that everybody knows, at the very least, we may not agree, but everybody at least is on the same page. We know what we're talking about. That's the only way that good legislation ever gets passed. That's the only way that good communication ever gets to happen. And that's the way that people feel like they're participating in the process. Right now, I think we're in such a partisan, hyper-broken way because people don't feel like they know what's going on. We have conspiracy theories because that makes an awful lot more sense than sitting down and talking about the fineries of the zoning code and how it works similar here to Groton, but not really the same, and how Bethlehem doesn't really have one. Discussing those issues requires time, and it requires effort, and it requires energy, and it requires the ability to be able to communicate clearly. That's what I bring to the table.
Okay, so for those of you who want to hear more, or if you want to offer your friends and neighbors an opportunity to hear more, Matt has offered office hours. So it's almost every Sunday, but the next office hour will be at 4 o'clock on Sunday, the 20th. I put my cell phone in the chat because I was able to, manage that. So, but if you are interested in joining that office hour Zoom, please send me your name and your email, and I'll go ahead and get that Zoom link out to you. Or if you have friends who were, you think should get to know Matt or meet Matt, or, would be, appreciative of the opportunity to have a direct conversation with the candidate, please let me know that too, and we'll get them on the Zoom link as well. Okay, so before I leave, I want to say one more time, thank you to Natasha and Bernardo, and really, really appreciate everybody coming tonight and the questions that were asked and some of the thoughtful nods that I got. I really appreciated that I saw some of you laughing at my jokes. Thank you. And I especially want to thank Matt because, I know he's running and asking for your trust and your vote, but it takes a lot of guts to run for office, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And I thank you, Matt, for stepping up because not everybody would. You're welcome. I read once recently that the single greatest fear for most people is public speaking. It dwarfs the fear of things like sharks or nighttime or claustrophobia, things like that. Public speaking. For whatever reason in my life, I never got that fear in the same way that everybody else did. So I'm willing to speak publicly for all of you. All I'm asking from you is for you to basically talk to me and let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what your ideas are. Let me know what's bothering you in terms of your communities that you live in and the community that we all share in the 66th. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely night. And this might be a good time to go ahead and upgrade your beverage, however you see that. I don't want to prejudge, but and we'll I already upgraded Zoom. I already did. You know what, dude, you're ahead of the pack. What can I say?
I know, I can't even help myself.
So thank you and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
No,
Thanks, Matt.
good night.
Thanks,
Good night.
Benita.
Thank you. Take